Greetings and a warm welcome to the first episode of the World Rescue Organisation's Trauma Care mini-series. For those who don't know me, my name is Ian Marriott. I'm a head assessor for the WRO, and together with Cameron Black, the WRO secretary, we will be hosting this event. In today's episode, our guest speaker is Mr. Tim Nutbeam. Tim is an expert in pre-hospital emergency care and has undertaken extensive research into the likelihood of spinal injuries occurring following a road traffic collision. He's also looked at the impact on patients during the extrication phase of a rescue. Throughout this session, Tim is going to share his insights that he has gained from his extensive research and from his experience and expertise in the field. So without further ado, let me hand over to Tim to deliver his presentation. Over to you, Tim.
Hello, my name's Tim Nutbeam, and today I'm going to be talking about the EXIT project. Many thanks to the World Rescue Organisation for inviting me to come along today. I hope you find this informative and enjoyable. So my name's Tim. I'm a consultant in emergency medicine and pre-hospital emergency medicine based in the southwest of the UK. I'm very lucky to spend my time working both in a major trauma centre, but also working for a pre-hospital critical care service. And I'm going to be talking today about my interest in extrication and particularly applying a scientific lens to look at extrication. The research we're going to look at today has been kindly funded by the Road Safety Trust, a UK-based charity which uses the profits made from education schemes for those who speed on the UK's roads to further our understanding of accident and injury and the pillars which make up the safe system in response to reducing morbidity and mortality associated with motor vehicle collisions. I'm very thankful for their support. So we're here to talk about extrication. So that's the process of removing injured or potentially injured patients from cars. All of you will have experienced these sorts of incidents. Some of you will have seen people who were alive when we first had contact with them, who perhaps passed away in their car or died on the way to hospital or in the first few hours that they've spent in hospital. When I started working in pre-hospital care, I noticed a disconnect between the injuries that we were worried about pre-hospital when it came to our extrication strategies and the injuries that we were seeing in hospital. I also experienced a disconnect between the timelines that we thought were important in terms of our application of extrication strategies and the timelines that we considered important in hospital. Many of you will have experienced this disconnect, this focus on movement minimization when it comes to our extrication strategies, and wondered how it impacts on patient care and wonder how it impacts on time critical injuries. And it was this idea of looking at this in detail, which gave birth to the EXIT project. So how are we going to approach this talk today? We're going to talk about the problem when it comes to motor vehicle collisions. We're going to talk about the history of extrication. We're going to talk about the evidence that we've generated and the historical evidence for extrication, come up with 10 take-home messages, and talk about future research. So what happens in a road traffic collision when it comes to the transfer of energy and injury? So the first thing that normally happens is an abrupt stop. The car stops, normally moving in a forward motion, and the patient comes to a rapid halt. Secondly, there's an interaction with the safety systems and car internal features. So that might be a seatbelt, it might be the steering wheel, it might be the glass which makes up the windscreen, it might be unsecured objects in the car. And there's a third transfer of energy as well, and this is the body's organs moving against each other or shearing forces, which particularly affect the brain and the neurons within the brain. And all these transfers of energy result in injury. It's also really important that we understand the interaction between the kinematics, that's the size and the direction of the energy. And that's normally relatively obvious, where we can see it when we look at the scene and we can see the damage to vehicles, the damage to road furniture, the marks on the road. But that interaction is complicated, or often made better by safety systems. So which safety systems were there? Were they utilised? Was the seatbelt worn by the passengers? Did the pretensioners go off? Did the airbag go off? So this is really, really important. And the final bit, which becomes important when we're discussing transfer of energy, is this concept of tissue tolerance. And this is very frequently overlooked. Each of us has an individual tissue tolerance, which is made up by a result of our comorbidities, what we've got medically, physically wrong with us, and also of our age. And that tissue tolerance varies vastly. You can imagine the tissue tolerance of a neonate, a newborn, is very low. And also it's very low in our older patients. The CT scan you can see on the right is an injury caused by a seatbelt and a relatively low deceleration injury, but with someone who has got a low tissue tolerance. So that perhaps exemplifies this interaction between understanding the kinematics, the transfer of energy, the size and direction of force, the safety systems, were they present, were they utilised, did they go off, and the individual tissue tolerance of the patient in front of us. So why is this important? Well, this is important because this transfer of energy leads to incredible amount of injury and death. So the UN has recently recognised that between the ages of 5 and 25, so children and young people, road traffic collisions are the #1 cause of death worldwide. And we know that that initial phase following the transfer of energy is very important for patient survival. So 50% of those deaths occur in the first few minutes, and then 15% more within the first 4 hours. So that intervention in the early phases following that transfer of energy, following that interaction with safety systems, following overcoming that individual patient's tissue tolerance, that is a really, really important time. And extrication is an important part of that time. So when an incident occurs, your responders in your health system will be where they will be. They might be on a base, they might have access to a helicopter, but they will be where they will be. The geographical location of the accident is fixed, and therefore the response time is relatively fixed. Also, the geographical location of your appropriate healthcare facility where you're going to take this patient is fixed. And sometimes that's a short distance, and sometimes that's an incredibly long distance, but we can't do much about that at the point of transfer of energy. Scene times are very variable though, and extrication makes up a significant part of the scene times for the patients that we see who are injured. So if we can make our extrication quicker, we can make our on-scene time shorter, and we can make our time to definitive, time-critical intervention shorter, and as a result, patients will do better. So when we started looking at extrication, what was happening? And this is still happening in many parts of the world. And the way we are taught on extrication courses is that we need to minimize movement, and we need to minimize movement almost above all else. And extrication strategies have evolved and developed based on the principle that excess movement, even small excess movement, will cause worsening of spinal injury and potentially death. And as a result, we deconstruct the vehicles around our patients. We remove patients from the vehicle, not allowing them to initiate movements themselves. And we know that this takes time. So we've got real world data which shows that the average extrication time in the UK is around about 32 minutes. And that's the same regardless of the training of the firefighters and regardless of if it's an urban or a rural setting. And that 32 minutes is important. If we're really concerned about minimizing secondary spinal injury, so primary spinal injury occurs with the initial transfer of forces. Secondary spinal injury is caused by edema and swelling, and what makes that worse is a lack of oxygen and a lack of tissue perfusion. And the longer you're trapped in the car, the more likely you are to have not enough oxygen and not enough tissue perfusion. So that's blood moving around the body with the appropriate driving pressure. So prolonged entrapment is bad for our spinal cord injuries. And that's really important to bear in mind when we're weighing up the harms and benefits of our extrication strategies and our approach. So the EXIT project aimed to provide some evidence. We use an evidence-based medicine approach to consider the problem of patients trapped in cars. And when you're considering an evidence-based medicine approach, you need to take into account the relevant scientific evidence, and where there are gaps, you need to generate more evidence. You need to consider patients' values and preferences. What do our patients want? What do they need? And then finally, you need to use the lens of expert clinical judgment to bring together that evidence, bring together the patient's values and preferences, and come up with an individual solution for the patient in front of you. And we use that EBM framework as a map for the studies that we carried out and our approach to extrication. And that's best demonstrated on this next slide. So we were interested in what scientific evidence was there and the generation of new scientific evidence. We were interested in capturing patients' values and preferences. And then we took that old data and the new data and those patients' values and preferences and asked experts from a fire and rescue background, from an operational background, and from a clinical background to help us bring that together into a set of recommendations. And those recommendations would now be evidence-based. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So starting with the systematic scoping review. So a systematic scoping review is where you go and you liaise with librarians and you have a look at evidence and you pull evidence out from national libraries, from firefighter manuals, from the internet, from medical papers, from libraries of science. And working with librarians, you come up with a search strategy to make sure you get as much of that literature together as possible. And this is what we did, and we looked right back from the kind of 1940s and beyond, really. And we looked at over 7,200 individual bits of reference. And when you bring these bits of paper together, these manuals together, these textbooks together, you can build a picture. And that picture demonstrates how our extrication practice mirrors and evolves with the ubiquitous use of the car as a primary means of transport. So we see cars coming onto our road in 1869 and the first deaths from motor vehicle around then. And we see, this is UK-based picture, if you like, but we see the first data on road traffic deaths being routinely collected from 1926. And then kind of between the 40s and the 70s, and it evolves at different rates in different parts of the world, that we see a move from informal rescue, often carried out by passers-by, the police and local mechanics, into a more formalised method of rescue, often carried out by firefighters. And we really start to see things change. In 1971, Halmatro patent the jaws of life. And we see, if you like, the development of formal rescue tools from there. And these tools are good. They're good at cutting apart cars and they're good at creating access. And then we see this interaction between a real concern about spinal cord injury and the availability of these tools. And more people become extricated. And we see this concept of being medically trapped evolve. So these are patients who previously wouldn't have been extricated. They'd have come out by another route. But now, because of concerns about their spinal cord, because of concerns about absolute movement minimization, they become medically trapped and they get extricated using a formal extrication technique, such as a roof-off technique. The really interesting thing is if you track spinal cord injuries as a proportion of total injuries across these decades, there isn't a massive change. My concern was, my bias was, that perhaps before central safety zones, crumple zones, seat belts, and all the safety systems we see nowadays, perhaps there was a high rate of spinal cord injury, and perhaps just I hadn't seen it in my practice since the early 2000s. But in fact, when you track this back over the decades, spinal cord injury has never been a major cause of morbidity and mortality associated with motor vehicle collisions. It's always been major head injury and major thoracic injury. And it's really interesting when you have a look at this paper, which is one of the earliest data sets I can find. So this is post-mortem studies of patients injured in motor vehicle collisions. The rate of spinal cord injury, those spinal injuries that we worry about causing disability, is less than 1%. And that's very similar to data, which I'm going to show you now. Looking at all that data, there was no clear evidence of how extrication strategies had evolved. There was no biomechanical evidence. There was no evidence of the scientific process being applied to our extrication strategies. So one of our main conclusions from our scoping review is that previous extrication strategies don't have a scientific basis. The other thing that our scoping review did is it highlighted where there were gaps in the literature, and those gaps we set out to fill. And we're now going to talk about some of the studies that we did. And studies 1, 2, and 3 were cohort studies, so looking at the Trauma Audit Research Network in the UK, which captures really detailed information from all traumatically injured patients, and considering that in the light of motor vehicle collisions and particularly entrapment. All these papers are free and open access. I'd encourage you, if you get an opportunity, to take a look. If you use your QR code reader on your phone, you'll get access. So study 1, does entrapment matter? So we looked at over 60,000 patients injured in motor vehicle collisions, and we found this big difference, which won't be a surprise to anyone on this call, this big difference between those who were trapped, mortality 8.9%, nearly a 10% chance of death, and those who weren't trapped, so a 5% chance of death. Interestingly, we found a low rate of spinal cord injuries. So when we looked at all patients who'd been extricated, the rate of spinal cord injuries was less than 1%, with many of the others having very severe time-dependent injuries. And even in those patients with spinal cord injuries, more than half of them had another time-significant injury as well, such as a head injury, such as a chest injury, which would stop oxygenation and then make your secondary spinal cord injury worse. Another important finding from this study is that once you excluded those who were obviously really, really sick, the remainder of patients all looked the same, and there was no discernible difference in blood pressure or heart rate or respiratory rate or any of the things that we like to measure. We like to get in the way of firefighters, and we like to put our monitoring on and we measure these numbers. These numbers were very, very poorly predictive of deterioration and death. And once you exclude those who were obviously very, very unwell, you end up with this very heterogeneous group. And some of them died, and some of them died very quickly, and some of them lived. But their numbers that we took, the heart rate, the respiratory rate, the blood pressure, weren't great at determining between those two groups because the numbers were very, very similar. So patients look the same. So one of our conclusions from this is that once you see that transfer of energy, so you've got the kinematics, you've got the safety systems, but you've overcome the tissue tolerance, once there is injury, predicting whether that's time critical injury or not is nearly impossible. And that's recently backed up by other papers in the literature as well. So that's study 1. Being trapped is bad and leads to excess death. Study 2, is age important? So we looked at over 70,000 patients stratified by age, and then we looked at different confounders. And it won't be surprising that older patients were much more likely to die, even with low injury loads. And particularly those over 80 who were trapped were significantly more likely to die. So that's important. And that's because these older patients have got a lower tissue tolerance. So even minor transfers of energy can overcome that tissue tolerance and lead to moderate to severe injury. And moderate injury in an older person is much more likely to lead to death than moderate injury in a younger person. We also considered this in the lens of self-extrication. So we came up with a list of injuries and physiological parameters, so things like a low blood pressure, which might stop you self-extricating a patient. And we found that throughout the decades of life, the ability to self-extricate, judged by these injuries and physiology, was about the same. So the incidence of injuries that would prohibit self-extrication was similar across all age ranges. So therefore, we shouldn't be ageist in our application of the principles of self-extrication. Study 3, does biological sex matter? So this was comparing females and males. We looked at, once again, 60, 70,000 patients. A quarter of them were female, and we found that females, and particularly younger females, interestingly, were more frequently trapped. We think this is an interaction between how cars are designed, the mechanism of injury associated with road traffic collisions. Females are much more likely to be hit on the side, and some biological factors such as the female pelvis. So we saw these different injury patterns, and we saw an increase in pelvic and spinal injuries in females. We've got more work to do in this area. There's some really interesting biases in how we deliver healthcare and how we deliver operational care that need further exploring, and we're looking to do that in the very near future. So following package 1, what are our take-home messages? Previous extrication strategies do not have a scientific basis. Trapped patients are more likely to die. Less than 1% of trapped patients will have a spinal cord injury. Clinical observations aren't great at predicting the future and can be falsely reassuring. Most patients don't have injuries which prevent self-extrication, and there are differences in outcomes and injuries between ages and biological sexes, but those differences aren't significant enough for us to recommend a change in extrication strategy based on age or based on sex. Now, this is the World Rescue Organization, so you'll be very interested in how this applies across the world. And this is a currently unpublished piece of work, but a piece of work that we're doing at the moment with the Global Burden of Diseases dataset. And this looks at the rate of spinal injuries as a percentage of, spinal cord injuries as a percentage of the total number of injuries caused by motor vehicle collisions between 2012 and 2019, which is when we've last got solid data for. And the interesting thing is these numbers are remarkably similar across the world. So they're between kind of 0.5% up to 1.6, 1.7%. And you can see that there are some differences, but those differences don't track lower and middle income countries versus higher income countries. They don't track particularly availability of vehicles or adoption of the safe system. They're small variables, but the numbers, proportion of spinal cord injuries as a proportion of total injuries is low throughout the world. And I think that's really important when you're considering how this evidence, how this research applies to your population. And the likelihood is that it does apply to your population. So we've looked at the systematic scoping review, we've looked at our retrospective cohort studies looking at trauma data, and now we're moving on to biomechanical analysis. So in studies 4, 5, 6, and 7, we used inertial measurement units, IMUs, which is similar to some of the technology used in computer game design to monitor patient movement. And I'm hoping you can see now that we can use these IMUs. We put lots and lots of them on a patient, and we can build up these 3D models. And for each of these models, we used many tens of patients across a range of BMIs, across a range of sexes, and then repeated the experiments many hundreds of times. And as a result, we got results that we can have some faith in. And we actually experimented using different methods of motion capture and found very similar results independent of the type of motion capture that we used. This is a roof-off type extrication that you can see happening now in front of you. So we use this technology, wide range of volunteers, range of males and females, range of ages. So what did we do? So one of the first studies we looked at was using these IMUs, these inertial measurement units, to look at self-extrication and look at the difference between collars and not collars, and instructions and not instructions, and all combinations of that. We did over 400 extrications across these 4 groups, so with and without collars, with and without instructions. And we found the smallest movements at the cervical spine, so the neck, in those with a collar applied and without instructions. And we thought actually giving the patient instructions encouraged less natural movement and therefore more movement. And collars definitely reduced movement. We also, when we looked at this, looked at total movement. So we looked at not just the maximal movement that the spine moved, but the total movement, on the basis that lots of smaller movements might cause inflammation, which could cause secondary spinal cord injury. And we found that collar application caused movement. So when you're leaning over to put a collar on in the car, that causes movement of the spine, and it's really difficult to interpret that through a clinical lens. But we found that total travel, so total movement, was similar whether you used a collar or whether you didn't use a collar. And we can explore that in more detail in future talks if people would like to. The next thing that we looked at was, and I think this is one of the more important papers and will probably be most relevant to this audience, is how to commonly utilize extrication techniques performed in real life, if you like, when we apply them with these IMUs on. And we looked at the traditional roof-off type extrication. We looked at a B-post rip. We looked at a rapid extrication, and I appreciate nomenclature will change in different parts of the country and in different countries, and we looked at self-extrication. So what did we find? So the bottom axis here is millimeters of movement. So the longer the bar, the more movement there is at the spine. And in theory, the more movement there is, the more likely there is to be a spinal cord injury. And you can see here that the roof-off extrication is the top line, and then B-post rip, and then the rapid extrication. And even though there are small differences in the size of the bar charts, you can see at the end there's these things called 95% confidence intervals. And these are these lines which look like extended H's which reach out from each of the bar charts. And they tell us that the true result, we can say with 95% confidence, lies within that chart, between those lines. And if that means that if this was a medical trial comparing 3 different types of painkillers, say paracetamol, aspirin, and ibuprofen, you would say that all of those painkillers were the same. You'd say that they all reduced pain by a similar amount, and there was no statistically significant difference between them. So that's also what we can say about these 3 extrication techniques. Roof off, B-post rip, and a rapid extrication all cause about the same amount of movement, and there's no statistically significant difference in movement between them. Remember, we've done this many hundreds of times using different motion capture techniques, and this is a finding which is common across every time that we've done this. These extrication methods cause a similar amount of movement at the patient's spine, And this is regardless of the type of movement. So we looked at rotational movements, flexion movements, side-to-side movements, forward-backwards movements. It's the same. And it's the same at different parts of the spine as well. So self-extrication, you can see at the bottom, performed better. It causes less than half the movement of other extrication techniques. So if we're interested in movement minimization, and remember, extrication is developed to minimize movement, so we must be, then self-extrication is superior to every other extrication technique. Moving on, we also looked at other techniques such as Scandinavian chain cabling, and we found that consistently again that self-extrication consistently caused the least movement, consistently the quickest to perform. All other extrication techniques performed about the same. Chain cabling caused more movement than roof-off type extrication, and there was a consistent signal that vehicle preparation, so whilst you're doing the cutting phase, that caused very little patient movement. So what are the take-home messages? Just to hammer it home, previous extrication techniques do not have a scientific basis. Trapped patients die more frequently. The rate of spinal cord injury in those who are trapped is low, less than 1%. Clinical observations are not good at predicting those patients who will rapidly deteriorate. Most patients do not have injuries which prevent self-extrication. There are differences now in outcomes and injuries between ages and biological sexes, but not enough to make us recommend a change in extrication strategy for them. Collars do reduce movement during extrication. I have no doubt about that, but the clinical importance of that in terms of avoiding secondary spinal injury is unclear. Self-extrication is superior. It is quicker and causes the least spinal movement. And all other extrication techniques that we looked at, roof-off type extrication, B-post, RIP, and rapid extrication, all performed about the same. So what's next? We've done our scoping review, we've done our expected cohort studies, we've done our biomechanical analysis, and now we needed to find out what our patients wanted. So what did our patients want? So this was a study of patients who had been trapped, and we included patients both with spinal cord injury and patients who didn't have spinal cord injury. And we interviewed them about their experience of entrapment and their experience of extrication. So what worked well for these patients? So patients really had a better experience if they had positive communication in language that they could understand. If they had companionship, and that's why we've recommended an extrication buddy, someone probably from a fire and rescue background in the car with them, with appropriate PPE, using language they can understand, talking them through the process of extrications. Those explications really made a difference to our patients. And so did post-incident follow-up. Finding out what had happened and explanations was really useful for our patients. What was less useful? What caused a negative experience? When communication failed, when technical language was used, when patients didn't know what was going on, when patients felt they had lost their autonomy, their ability to make decisions about their extrication experience. Patients didn't like being in pain, no surprises there. They didn't like it when they found out about things later down the line, so delayed communication. And there was a real strong theme about onlookers taking photos of vehicles and also those vehicles appearing on social media later. Patients didn't like that and found that very triggering and very difficult. So we've been through these take-home messages very recently, but just to add the last one, number 10, patients value communication and they value having a dedicated extrication buddy. So we took all that data, we took the historical data from our scoping review, we took the new data that we generated, we took our patients' experience data, and we dropped that into what's called a Delphi study. And a Delphi study is where experts, subject matter experts, interact anonymously from each other. They don't know who's participating, and it means that views can be expressed freely and openly. We invited each of the groups that you can see in the slide. So these are all UK-based groups, but we invited our College of Paramedics, our Faculty of Pre-Hospital Emergency Care, the National Fire Chiefs Council, the UK Rescue Organisation, and 2 local research groups, national level research groups, to contribute subject matter experts to take part in this Delphi study. Please use the QR code, please Google it, it's free and open access. And if you're going to read one paper, this is probably it, because it came up with consensus across a large number of domains. And we took that consensus and we worked with these groups to come up with a set of principles. And that set of principles are the outputs of the exit project. And there's not time today to go into those principles in detail. I'll happily put together another talk and we can talk through the scientific basis of those if that's useful for people. But some real key takeaways. All patients with evidence of injury should be considered time dependent and their entrapment time should be minimized. So patient clinical observations are a poor predictor of patient outcome. When you have the kinematics which overcome your safety systems and then overcome your patient tissue tolerance, you have injury. And it's difficult to predict which injuries are time critical, even in the hands of experts. So all patients should be considered time dependent. And when we're planning our extrication strategy, it should be with time as our focus rather than absolute movement minimization as our focus. Of course, we want you to be gentle. We want you to be gentle because it's the nice thing to do. It's the kind thing to do. If you're in pain, you want to be handled gently. If you've got a clot which is on your liver and stopping it bleeding, you want to be handled gently. But that's not absolute movement minimization. That's gentle handling. And remember that self-extrication is the superior extrication technique. So all patients should be offered the opportunity to self-extricate. And we should facilitate self-extrication as well. We should be helpful. We should open doors. We should ask patients. We should offer our arm to help them out. We should provide them with gentle support. And once again, we can talk about that in more detail about how we self-extricate and where this isn't dragging patients out of cars. This is self-extrication, which is very different. So we've done some science. You've hopefully found that really useful. So what's missing? What's next? So there's lots that still needs to be done. So what about our approach to the physically trapped patient? Which clinical interventions should be done early? What is the benefit of bystander care and firefighter delivered care? What about earlier tranexamic acids? That's a medicine which has been shown to reduce the mortality associated with trauma by reducing blood loss. How do we reliably identify patients with no injuries so that we can discharge them at scene or that we can trigger a different care pathway? All these are big questions which remain unanswered and our study team is looking currently about how we answer them. So I hope that you found this information useful. I'm sure it will generate many questions and much discussion, and that's really welcome. Please reach out. I can be contacted on Twitter or via my email address, and I'm really happy to have conversations. Many thanks to the World Rescue Organisation for inviting me to put this talk together, and I look forward to working with you and your groups in the future as we explore some of this scientific evidence and work together to fill in these gaps around extrication and how we put our patients first and how that leads to better patient outcomes. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tim. A really thought-provoking presentation. Your research is undoubtedly going to influence how first responders approach road traffic collisions in the future, and perhaps most importantly, it's going to save lives. Thank you everybody for taking the time out of your busy schedules to watch this video and presentation. Until next time, please stay safe, stay informed, and keep making a positive impact. Thank you.